Friends, on this Juneteenth Sunday, and as our nation approaches its 250th birthday, our reading this morning is a brief excerpt from W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America. Nations reel and stagger along their way. They make hideous mistakes. They commit frightful wrongs. And they do great and beautiful things. Shall we not best guide humanity forward by telling the truth about all this? So far as truth is ascertainable. Here ends our reading. Friends, if you and I were to walk together through the burying ground next door, we would discover there, among the tombstones of early settlers and wealthy merchants, Harvard presidents and reverend clergy, the grave of a 15-year-old girl known as Cicely. Her tombstone tells us that Cicely was of African descent and that she was enslaved by the Reverend William Brattle, minister of this church, who is also laid to rest in the burying ground. A couple of years ago, we spent some time reflecting together on Cicely's story. But hers is only the tip of the iceberg. We know that for many years the members and even the ministers of First Parish participated in and financially benefited from the slave trade. In an attempt to Christianize those they enslaved, church members would often bring their slaves with them to church. Thanks to research done by David Kidder for our sister congregation over at First Church, we know, for example, that between 1698 and 1776, 36 enslaved people were admitted to membership here at First Parish. The first was Philip in 1698, the last Dilla in 1776. 33 of these enslaved members were of African descent. 3 were Native American. Each was baptized and accepted the church covenant. However, enslaved people were admitted to a lower class of church membership that did not give them the right to vote at church and in many cases receive communion. And here, like in many New England congregations, enslaved peoples and other free non-white people sat in the balcony. Sometimes I look out in the balcony and imagine that great cloud of witnesses. In addition to these 36 enslaved church members, David Kidder discovered the names of some at least 60 free African American and indigenous persons, many formerly enslaved, who were baptized, married, or buried by First Parish ministers in the decades before and after slavery ended in Massachusetts. Among that number was a woman named Cuba Vassell. Her name appears in the membership rolls of First Parish on September 16, 1812. The entry reads, Cuba Vassell, Negro woman, baptized by her own desire, parentheses, in private, dangerously ill. Who was Cuba Vassell? This morning, in honor of Juneteenth, I'd like to share with you some of what we know about her story. From her birth in slavery, into slavery in the Caribbean, to her long journey to Massachusetts and Cambridge, and eventually to freedom. And to her decision just days before her death to be baptized into this congregation, our congregation, a decision that forever binds her story to our own. She, like all other former First Parish members, are our spiritual ancestors. And what we make of this shared ancestry with enslavers and enslaved, as well as the formerly enslaved, is up to us, right? It's up to us what we do with that legacy. How can it enlarge us to consider Cuba Vassal's story as related to our own? What responsibilities does it place upon us? These are some of the questions I invite us to reflect on this Juneteenth Sunday, just 2 weeks before our nation's 250th birthday. Cuba was born in the Caribbean island of Antigua in 1734. Her mother, Abba, gave her the name Cuba according to West African day-naming traditions, where a child is named based on the day of week they were born. About 100 years before Cuba's birth, Antigua had been colonized by the British, who began importing enslaved West Africans to work on their plantations growing tobacco and sugar. Abba, Cuba, and Cuba's 5 siblings, Robin, Walker, Nuba, Trace, and Toby, worked on the plantation of a man named Isaac Royal. The Royal family would go on to be major benefactors of Harvard University and feature prominently in Harvard's reckoning with its own legacy of slavery. There are still professorships at Harvard named after the Royals. In 1737, when Cuba was just 3 years old, Isaac Royal left Antigua and returned to his farm in Medford, Massachusetts. He brought Cuba's family and about 20 other enslaved people with him. But just 2 years later, Isaac Royal died and bequeathed Cuba and her family to his daughter Penelope. When Cuba was 8 years old, Penelope married Henry Vassall of Cambridge. The Vassals also made their fortune growing tobacco and sugar with enslaved labor in the Caribbean. So that's how young Cuba, born in Antigua, came to live here in Cambridge, just around the corner, in fact, on an estate on Brattle Street that includes what we now know as the Longfellow House, George Washington Headquarters National Park. For the rest of her life, from age 8 to 78, Cuba lived here in Cambridge, no more than a half-mile radius from this meeting house, among a community of enslaved and later free people of African descent. She and her siblings likely worked as domestic servants in the Vassall house or as laborers in the orchards, garden, small farm, and stables on the Vassall estate. When Cuba came of age, she married Anthony, Henry Vassall's enslaved coachman. At some point, Cuba and Anthony took as their own the last name of their enslaver, Vassall. And together they had 5 children: James, Flora, Darby, Cyrus, and Nancy. In 1769, Henry Vassall died with massive debt, putting Cuba and her family in an even more precarious position. To pay off the family debt, Henry's wife Penelope began selling off property, including the people they enslaved. Penelope sold Cuba and her son James to her nephew John Vassall, who lived just across the street. She sold Kuba's daughter, Flora, just 2 years old, to a family much further away in Billerica. And she sold Kuba's infant son, Darby, to a man in Woburn. The cruel practice of family separation was common among New England slaveholders. Newly separated from her husband and her children, Kuba, from that moment on, had two great missions in life: to reunite her family and to secure their freedom and her own. Her efforts on both of these fronts were aided by the rapidly evolving political situation in Massachusetts. As revolutionary fervor grew, families loyal to the crown, like the royals and vassals, began to lose power and influence. Their fortunes and sometimes their lives were endangered. In 1774, facing harassment from local patriots, the White vassal family fled their homes in Cambridge and moved to Boston to live under protection of the British troops there. Kuba and her family remained on Brattle Street, their legal status now uncertain. During this time, Kuba and Anthony were able to secure the return of their children, Flora and Darby. At the age of 40, for the first time in her life, Kuba found herself living with her family united without the presence of enslavers. On March 17, 1776, General George Washington finally drove the British from Boston, a campaign that he planned and led from his headquarters on the vassal estate on Brattle Street, with Kuba and her family living beside him on the same property. British troops and over 1,000 loyalists evacuated Boston, never to return. John Vassall and his family sailed to England, never came back. Their large estate in Cambridge was eventually confiscated by the newly formed state government. For the first 6 years after the Revolutionary War, Kuba and Anthony and their family continued living on the Brattle Street estate, farming about 3/4 of an acre. But they barely made ends meet. In 1781, Anthony petitioned the state for compensation for his enslavement from the vassal estate. His petition read in part, "Though dwelling in a land of freedom, both the petitioner and his wife have spent almost 60 years of their lives in slavery, deprived of what makes them now happy beyond expression. One hopes that they shall not be denied the sweets of freedom the remainder of their days by being reduced to the painful necessity of begging for bread." Anthony's petition was successful, and he was awarded an annual pension of £12 from the vassal estate. By 1787, 6 years later, Kuba and Anthony had saved up enough money to purchase a home of their own on 5 acres of land at what is now the corner of Shepherd Street and Mass Ave. There, Anthony and Kuba and their family lived out the remainder of their days, with Anthony working well into his 80s and 90s as a paid laborer and yeoman farmer. Anthony Vassall died on September 2, 1811, at the reported age of 98. Just 1 year later, on September 16, 1812, Cuba followed him in death. She was 78. Born into slavery in the Caribbean, she died a free woman in Cambridge. Perhaps she died surrounded by her now adult children, whom she'd worked so hard to protect and reunite. But we don't know. Neither do we know where Cuba and Anthony Vassal were buried or where their remains lie. One thing we do know is that 3 days before her death, on September 13, 1812, Cuba made a free choice, a decision recorded in the membership records here at First Parish. Cuba Vassal, Negro woman, baptized by her own desire, in private, dangerously ill. Her baptism was almost certainly performed by the Reverend Abiel Holmes, father of Oliver Wendell Holmes and minister of this church from 1792 to 1831. We don't know if Cuba attended First Parish before her decision to be baptized here, though it's likely that while enslaved by the Vassal family, she attended church with them at Christ Church. We do know that she chose not to be baptized in the church of her former enslaver. Her decision to be baptized at First Parish came at a time when the church was increasingly divided among progressive Unitarians and conservative Calvinists, a division that eventually led to a split in the congregation, with the Calvinists heading up the road to form what is now called First Church. At least one of Cuba's children remained close to the Unitarian movement. Her son, Darby Vassal, who'd been separated from his family as an infant, moved to Boston in adulthood, where he became a leader among the community of free blacks on Beacon Hill. Vassal founded the Abiel Smith School, the first school for black children in Boston, and was a leader in the New England Anti-Slavery Society, taking up his mother's struggle for freedom. Darby Vassal and his family were lifelong members of the Unitarian Brattle Street Church in Boston. Curiously, when Darby Vassal died on October 12, 1861, he chose to be buried back here in Cambridge, where he'd grown up, in a tomb beneath Christ Church that belonged to the family of his former enslavers. We don't know why he chose to be buried beside his family's enslaver, just as we don't know why Cuba chose to be baptized here at First Parish. But both made their decision in freedom. One of the final indignities inflicted upon people of color in colonial and revolutionary New England came at the time of death. It was common practice in New England for the church bell to toll repeatedly for the death of a white person in the parish. When a non-white person died, if the bell tolled at all, it tolled just once, marking one's racial subjugation even unto death. Friends, I invite us to pause now and sit with the story of Cuba Vassal, with the little we know of her life, to sit with what her story might mean for us and for our congregation and for our community, for our nation as it approaches its 250th birthday. As we reflect I've asked Kevin, our building manager, and my son Nico to toll the church bell for a full minute to honor the life of a free woman, Kuba Vassal, member of this parish. Let us be together in a time of memory and reflection.